Good morning. We will begin this session. Then I present me. I'm Dorothee Boccanfuso. I am professor at the UM6P in Rabat, Morocco. And I'm happy to be with you this morning to moderate this session. And we have 3 papers. Then I propose that I see before in other parallel session that the presenter, we have a presentation, we have a comment and discussion on each paper. I think that we have 3 papers, then 1 hour and a half, then 30 minutes for each paper, 10 to 50 minutes for presentation, 5 minutes for comment, and the floor with question and intervention for 5 to 10 minutes or so. It's okay? Then we will begin with the first paper. I think you are the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Elmallakh. I'm an economist in the office of the chief economist for the World Bank MENA region. And today I'm going to be presenting a paper on returns to education in the marriage market with a focus on Egypt. And this paper is co-authored with Deng, who's a consultant in our office, Luca, Flabbi, who's a professor of economics at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and Roberta, Gatti, the chief economist for the MENA region at the World Bank. So this paper bounces off a well-known paradox in the MENA region, which is that despite increases in female education over the past 2 decades, we still observe that female labor force participation rates had remained low. So for example, female labor force participation rates in the MENA region are found to be the lowest in the world, with only 1/5 of the working age population in the labor force in 2021. Yet we also see that education has been improving for women in the MENA region. So for example, according to data from the World Bank, growth tertiary enrollment in ratio stood at 43% for women versus only 39% for men. So taking together these 2 stylized facts, we ask why do parents invest in costly educational decisions when at the end the daughters would not grow up to be working and to be engaged in the labor force. So we argue in this paper that it's very important to be looking at both marriage market returns in addition to standard labor market returns. And just to give you an overview of what we do in this paper, we use data from the Egypt labor market panel surveys. And we focus on marriage market returns. For the most part, we focus on bride price payments, but we also look at other marriage market returns, such as, for example, the wages of the husband at the time of marriage and another measure of lifetime earnings. And we exploit a unique policy reform that led to a staggered, it's a staggered reform that led to an exogenous variation in the years of schooling and also degree completion by actually reducing the number of years that were necessary to complete primary education from 6 to 5 years. And as I mentioned, we focus in this paper on Egypt, and that's because for at least 2 reasons. First of all, it's an exemplar case study for the aforementioned puzzle that I discussed earlier, which is the low female labor force participation combined with increases in female education, and also it's also a good case study because of the common practice of bride price, which allows us to quantify the effect of returns to education in terms of marriage market. So on bride price in Egypt, it's an important amount of resources that it's transferred by the groom and his family to the bride at the time of marriage. In our case, we focus on an asset-based definition of bride price. So we focus on the mahr, which is the amount that's transferred by the groom and his family to the bride at the time of marriage. We also focus on other components of the bride price, such as the shapka, which is the jewelry afsh, which is the furniture, and then jihez, which is anything from, for example, electrical appliances to the clothing that's necessary for the bride for her marriage. And then we also focus on the total value of the housing as contributed by the groom and his family. So just to give you an idea of how we compute our indicator of bride price, as I mentioned earlier, this is focusing only on these components, and also we focus on these on the contributions that are made by the husband and his family to the bride at the time of marriage. And we typically focus on the information if it's reported by the bride, and then we only use the information reported by the husband if only the bride does not report this type of information. And it's a very large sum, so the median bride price is equivalent to 4.7 years of wages for the median male worker in 2018, and here I'm talking only about the contributions, again, that are made by the husband and his family to the groom, to the bride at the time of marriage. And in this figure, we're showing on the left-hand side the bride price payments in 1,000 Egyptian pounds, and then on the right-hand side, we're looking at the bride price components as a percent of the total. So as you can see, this is done by educational levels. So here, for example, we're looking at the no educational degree, primary and preparatory education, secondary, and then tertiary. So as you can see, there is a positive association between the bride price payments and the educational level. And when we look at the breakdown of these various components as a percent of the total, you can see that there are some components that remain stable no matter what is the level of education of the bride, but at the same time you see that there are some other components such as this one, which is, for example, the housing, that is increasing with the level of education, whereas, for example, if you look at the mahr, you see that it's declining with education. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the literature, but we contribute to various strands of the literature. So for example, we contribute to the broader literature on female labor force participation and what affects long-term trends in female labor force participation, which could include, for example, changes in technology, social norms, cultural shifts, and so on. We also contribute to the regional literature, which has focused on the impact on how to explain this paradox in the MENA region, and has highlighted the role of the public sector and the downsizing of the public sector as one of the main reasons why we observe this paradox. And then we also contribute more broadly to the literature on bride price payments, and how either bride price could be one of the reasons why families invest in education, but also more broadly how bride price can be used by families in order, for example, to smooth some income shocks. So for the sake of time, I'm just gonna move directly to the methodology that we use in this paper. So we estimate this following equation. YICD is the outcome of interest. So this is the outcome of we're focusing on women, obviously, and this is the outcome of individual I in birth cohort C, living, who was born actually in district D. And then we have our main variable of interest is the SICD, which is the schooling, and we focus on compulsory degree completion, which is in Egypt both primary education and preparatory education. And then we have a vector XICD, which is a vector of individual controls. We're including controls for the bride's age at the time of marriage, as well as a dummy variable indicator for rural residency at birth. And then we also are including birth cohort fixed effects, as well as district of birth fixed effects. So our main variables of interest are, for one, we're looking at price payments, but also we're looking at both two measures of other marriage market returns, such as, for example, as I mentioned, the wage at the time of marriage for the husband, as well as a measure of lifetime earnings. So as you expect, this type of regression is challenged by at least two sources of endogeneity. The first one is the standard omitted variable bias, because we could be, for example, omitting some characteristics that could be affecting both the schooling decision and at the same time bride price payments. But also this is further complicated by the fact that that there could be also some sorting of spouses over unobservables. So to deal with this type of challenge, we are going to exploit a school reform that took place in school year 1988. And what it did, this reform, is that basically it reduced the number of years of schooling of primary education, which were before the reform 6 years of schooling, to 5 years of schooling after the reform. So this reform, from a conceptual standpoint, could affect schooling decisions in at least 2 ways. So on one hand, it could lead students to complete primary education and subsequent educational levels at higher rates because the cost of education is now lower. But also, on the other hand, we could expect that this type of reform, which basically led to a condensation of the curriculum, could also lead to learning losses. So in this case, this could also, on the other hand, lead to the opposite effect, which would be that we would observe a decline in degree completion or a reduction in years of schooling. So this is, in this chart, we're showing the reform rollout, both over time and over space. So I'm not sure if you can read very clearly the labels of this chart. So this is, this first one here, this is the 1977, which is technically the first cohort that would be affected by this particular reform. So this is the first cohort to which we would expect that they would be starting to follow the 5-year regime instead of the 6-year regime. And here we're basically showing the percent of district that would be either following a fully 5-year regime, or where individuals are basically reporting a mixture of, some of them are following the 5-year regime and some are following the 6-year regime. And then you see that there are some districts where we only observe individuals that are following the fully 6 regime. So as you can see, this is the cohort of interest, basically. As you can see that from this chart, the reform seems to be rolling out even before its actual implementation, which would affect the 1977 cohort. And as we move away from the cohort of interest, you can see that we're starting to transition more towards a fully 5 regime, which means that the districts within the cohorts, that as you move away from the 1977 cohort, more districts are actually having individuals that are reporting that they are fully following the 5-year regime. And the same story when you look over time. So this is again the 1977 cohort, and as you can see, this is the gradual implementation of the reform. So you can see that also this is the share of individuals that would be reporting a 5-year regime, and this is also increasing over time. So we see a penetration more deeply within districts, but also over time. So this is the stagger rollout of the reform, and we're using both these two sources of variations, which is the variation between cohort and districts, but also within this C times D cell. So we're adopting this identification strategy, and we're using an instrumental variable approach, controlling for 2 fixed effects. So the first one is the cohort of birth fixed effect, and the second one is the district of birth fixed effect. And our main variable of interest is again the schooling, which is instrumented now by this reform. And now turning to our first set of results. So these are the IV estimates that we're getting from our benchmark regressions. So we're looking at the effect of completion of compulsory education on the log of bride price, and then we're looking also at the different components of the bride price. So we find that the brides that completed compulsory education are on average more likely to have a higher bride price, and this is basically a doubling of the amount of bride price. And we see that this result is entirely driven by an increase in the amount of the housing. And just to give you a sense of the order of magnitude, we find that this is approximately the equivalent of $6,650 in 2018 prices as an increase in the value of the housing. Now we also look at different marriage market returns. So we're looking at both the imputed wage of the husband at the time of marriage, and also the imputed permanent income of the husband at the time of marriage. And in the first 2 columns, we're reporting the OLS estimates, and then in the last 2 columns, we're reporting the IV estimates. And once again, we find the same effects, which is basically that a higher level of education of the bride is also associated with higher marriage market returns, also reflected by higher wages of the husband and higher lifetime earnings. Even though the paper does not necessarily try to address all the channels through which this type of effect could be taking place, we highlight that there is at least some evidence that supports that assortative mating might be one of the reasons why we observe these results. So in the left chart, this is a heat map in which we are looking at the wife's educational attainment against the husband's educational attainment. And the red shade is showing the high percentages. So as you can see, both at the upper and the lower end of the distribution of education, we see some evidence of positive assortative mating, which means that women with lower levels of education are more likely to marry men with low levels of education, and vice versa. Women with high levels of education are also more likely to marry other men with higher levels of education. And then in the table on the right-hand side, we're looking at both the OLS results and the IV results from a regression in which we're looking again at the compulsory degree completion, and then we're looking as outcomes variables. We're looking at the years of schooling of the husband as well as the years of schooling of the father-in-law. And we find that, for example, a bride that completes compulsory education from our IV regressions, we find that it's associated with approximately 9 additional years of schooling for the husband, and then similarly we find that it is associated with approximately 4 years of schooling for the father-in-law. So they are more likely to marry husbands with higher levels of education, but also to marry into more highly educated households. So our results are robust to various checks. I'm just presenting a few here. So one of them is that we're using different fixed effects. We're also using different endogenous variables. Instead of focusing on compulsory degree completion, we're using secondary degree completion or years of schooling as endogenous variables. That we're also showing some results where we're looking at different definitions of the bride price and definitions that would not necessarily be asset-based. And our results are robust to these various checks. And we also have some other robustness checks that relate to the assignment of the treatment, the assignment of the reform, and our results are robust to these checks as well. So to conclude, this paper looks at the impact of education on marriage market returns. We find that there are substantial marriage market returns, and we argue that it's very important to look at both labor market returns and marriage market returns when we want to understand the incentives behind the schooling decisions that we observe in the region. We highlight that there are various returns that are reflected by higher bride price payments, but also other marriage market returns, such as, for example, marrying into highly educated husband, marrying into highly educated households, but also returns in terms of wages and lifetime earnings of the husband. And then we also conclude with a policy recommendation, which is that we say that even that policies that would be aiming to promote education and increasing education in the region should be done in conjunction with other policies that would better align the incentives of increasing education in terms of in favor of higher female labor force participation and work. And on this note, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to questions and the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Then we have a comment now by Rana.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much, Nelly. And I would like to thank actually Nelly and her co-authors for the excellent work. That was very interesting reading this paper. So I really enjoyed it. And also for the effort you've put, especially in the identification of this model. So just to summarize very quickly, so what the authors are trying to do is to examine the effects of females' education on marriage market returns, measuring marriage market returns by a number of measurements. The first one is the bride price, as explained clearly by Nelly, but also using two other measurements maybe that Nelly didn't talk much about during the presentation, but it's explained in details in the paper. Those are the husband's wages at the time of marriage. So they are using the 3 rounds of the ELMPS, limiting the sample to Muslim women because, you know, some of those categories of the bride prices are only paid in the case of Muslim women, and I'll not go over this because Nelly explained it very well, how they are trying to fix for that endogeneity of education choices and decisions. And the main finding they get is a positive association between education and the bride price. So as explained by Nelly, basically more educated women manage to marry more educated men, but not only this, they manage to marry richer men. So which is pretty interesting to see for the case of Egypt. Now, it was pretty hard to comment on this paper because it's very well written, of course, and the type of analysis you're doing, and you're doing a lot of robustness checks, which is really, really interesting. Now, I have some concerns about the strong assumptions you're making about the imputation of husbands' annual wages at the time of marriage. And my suggestion, because all that part about the bride prices is pretty interesting, and I would suggest to just limit the paper to that part, and because, you know, I mean, if you send this to a journal, I mean, reviewers can have problems with that part related to imputation of husbands' annual wages and the assumptions you're making about, you know, so basically what the authors are doing, they are summing all wages since the year of marriage, and then they divide by the number of years of marriage, which is, you know, I was wondering if you know anything about the employment status at the year of marriage, which I don't think you have that piece of information unless you go back in time with the retrospective information in the ELMPS and try to see, you know, because we do have the first job, the year for the first job, the characteristics of the first job, whether this first job was before or after or at the year of marriage. So maybe you can do more work if you really want to keep that part, show us more descriptives, you know, convincing the reader that what you're doing to estimate those wages are correct. Also, another assumption that you know, made me think about, so basically what you're assuming is, or what you're controlling for is the rurality status at the time of marriage, and you're assuming that this is the one for birth, so you're controlling for the region at birth. So again, you know, given internal migration and especially that you're looking at relatively younger cohorts, so some of these cohorts might have migrated from rural to urban, so do you take that into consideration? And of course, I mean, let me, because I know I don't have enough time, but let me go to my main comment about the main finding of this paper, which is housing. You know, so basically, what they find is that housing is that item of the bride price that is mostly affected by the education of women. So basically, if you're more educated, you manage to marry a husband that is living in a more expensive house. So I would really want to see more descriptives about that. I don't know if you managed to do anything trying to link housing, the characteristics of housing at the time of marriage, and then the current, because we do have that information also in the ELMPS, the characteristics of the current house where they live, if they are still married, you know, where they are living, but also, you know, we have information about the size of the house, whether they own this house or they are renting it, and things like that. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rana. Then I open the floor You have comments, question? Yes.
So I'm really excited about this paper and about this work in general. I think it's fantastic that we're looking at the marriage market returns of investments in education. And you really can't make sense of the fairly equal investments in education by gender in the region without understanding that marriage market aspect, given the very differential labor force participation. But given this really wonderful identification strategy, there's actually quite a bit more one can push that research agenda. I'm not saying you should do it in this paper, but clearly we would want to know, use that technology to see, so why is it that women get better marriage market outcomes? Because the husband's families feel that they are better mothers and they are better able to transmit that human capital to their children. So looking at child human capital outcomes could potentially be a very interesting outcome to look at, and the effect of women's education on child human capital outcomes using that same identification technology. Now, of course, that policy, there's a reversal of that policy a number of years later, which added the 6th year of education, which then would allow us to look at even younger women, and hopefully the new version of the NMPS would allow us to look at that. So I think that there's a really wonderful research agenda going forward, given that very powerful identification strategy. Just a couple of comments. I'm not so comfortable with the use of bride price as an indication of the entire package of contribution from the groom's family, given that bride price is usually referred to as the mahr, which is the one component. So I think it would be better to refer to it as the groom's family contribution, economic contribution to the marriage, or something along that, so that would indicate, because bride price just does not seem to include things like housing and other things like that. But I think you're absolutely right to use the broader definition of the contribution rather than simply the narrow bride price. The final comment is I would have liked to see some of the first stage results, because I think they're important in their own right. You actually said they could go either way. You didn't tell us which way they went.
Thank you very much. This is Yılmaz Kılıçarslan from Anadolu University, Turkey. Thank you for your presentation. It's very interesting. I'm kind of shocked that, this bride price is too common in Egypt. I was wondering if there is a tendency of decrease in bride price or a tendency of disappearance of this habit in Egypt. If so, are you dealing with this issue in your analysis? Thank you. Because there was a bride price in Turkey as well, but now it's almost disappeared in the west of Turkey. There are still in the east of Turkey in villages. So I was wondering if there is a such tendency. Thank you.
In Turkey, in the east of Turkey, actually, like given direct cash or animals sometimes even to the families in the villages. But here mostly like furniture support or housing support, still we do in Turkey, even west of the Turkey. For instance, if two guys are married, parents are buying the furniture for them, but it is not the bride price, what we mean, because Western Turkey, they don't have this bride pricing, but they can give house, they can give furniture, so maybe it's wrong to call it bride price, because still we have also this, it's kind of traditional contribution, economic contribution mostly.
Just it's a continuing comment based on Ragi's and Öznur's one. Yeah, in Turkey we have this, and it's very different in rural, particularly lower education segment of the households. You give directly cash or some stuff, but when even the higher educated two individuals are marrying in Turkey, even two of them are rich families, the groom's family just are responsible to give some part of the housing stuff, etc. in Turkey. So this is not really a kind of the bride price, but I mean, this is a tradition in another way. So maybe you can, I don't know how, there's an obvious indigeneity problem, but for the different segments of education, maybe you can run your regressions and try to understand which is more effective, the bride price in terms of the narrower definition or broader definition. So this could give an idea.
Thank you so much, Rana, for your excellent comments. They're very helpful for us when we're going to revise this manuscript. Also, thank you, Ragi. Thank you. Thanks everyone. Thanks all the colleagues for their excellent comments. So I'm going to start first by addressing some of the comments that Rana presented. So the first one is regarding whether we should be only focusing on bride price or we should also look at the other outcomes. So while I fully agree that the assumptions that we're making regarding the husband imputed wages at the time of marriage and lifetime earnings might be a bit too restrictive, I think that they are perhaps also useful to bring this discussion into this discussion other marriage market returns that are not just purely bride price, because we also get the other comment, which is basically what would it mean if the bride has higher bride price? What does that mean if she has higher value of the housing? So we want to just bring into the picture the whole discussion onto how higher bride price may also reflect better marriage market outcomes, which, as we know from the literature, are generally associated with either better post-marital outcomes or better female well-being outcomes after the marriage. So I think what I take from this point is that perhaps we need to do a little more work into the imputation of the husband wages, and I think we can do perhaps something along the lines that you suggested, maybe looking at some retrospective information on wages and trying to see if we can do something with the retrospective information that we have from the ELMPS data, which is also very rich. So one thing that we're doing so far is that we just look descriptively as to whether the assumption of being employed at the time of marriage is a good assumption, and it seems to be validated by the data. So for example, in 2018, we see something above 90% of the husbands are indeed employed at the time of marriage, so we kind of consider that this is a good enough assumption. But then one assumption that wouldn't be perhaps as strong is the fact that we kind of consider that these husbands have to be employed for every single year from the time of marriage until retirement, which is perhaps a very strong one. So perhaps we can try to do some robustness checks to see whether the results would hold to different imputation methods. We do one with respect to the indigeneity of the schooling decision also for the husband by using the exact same instrumentation, but we should do more regarding the other underlying assumption for the imputation itself. Now turning to the question on the migration from 1 minute. So turning to the question on migration, I think I have to think more carefully about it. We haven't done anything to take that into account, but I think we can perhaps try to see whether we can account for that in our framework. But in a sense, the district information at birth, we're not using it to account for the time of the district at the time of marriage, but rather to account for the schooling, where these individuals would be when the schooling reform took place. So that's one thing. And then it's a very good point, the one you're making regarding the characteristics of the housing at the time of marriage and at the time of the survey, and this is something I think that would make the paper definitely stronger. Ragi's points are also excellent, so I think there is a lot more that we can do regarding this research agenda, and it doesn't have to be necessarily restricted on bride price payments, and I think one can easily do like the same type of exercise by looking at outcomes for children and educational attainment. And I also take the point that all of you raised. I think many people here raised the issue about how we're calling the transfers of the bride price, basically, and that we should perhaps have a different naming for the components that we're looking at. We do in the paper though have a discussion on where the initial bride price came from as a name in the literature, and that's why we're following the standard literature by using bride price, but perhaps we should rethink the way we're calling it. So thank you all again for the excellent comments.
Thank you very much. Then now we have a second paper. Yes.
And thank you for this invitation. And I'm Aysit Tansel, and this is a joint work with Moundir Lassassi, my colleague from Algeria, and our topic is do educational mismatches influence job satisfaction and on the job search in Algeria. And I'm going to do the presentation, and my colleague Moundir will answer the questions. And labor market effects of job satisfaction and on the job search are very important. And how widespread is job mismatch? And we can only find information on OECD countries. From OECD statistics in 2020, it's 36% of the workforce in OECD countries are in mismatched jobs. And we don't have, to our knowledge, we don't have any statistics from developing countries and MENA countries. And I would also like to say, so it's quite a large part of the workforce have a job mismatch. And how do we define job mismatch? And there are two types of definitions. One is educational mismatch, and that is defined as over-education if your years of education is more than the years required for the job, and under-education if it is less than required for the job. And I should be hitting this. And so I'm going to talk about the mismatches a little bit, and then tell few words about Algerian labor markets and introduce our data sources and our results, and give some implications for policy. And as I said, this job satisfaction and search on the job search behavior in the labor market are important indicators about the labor market. And as I said, we have job mismatch, education defined according to education, over-education and under-education, and we use for that job requirements from ISCO, International Standard Classification of Occupations. Now there is also job skill mismatches, and they are indicated by the worker's response to the following statement. My current job offers me sufficient scope to use my knowledge and skills. And in our paper, we have 4 sections. In the first section, we look at the determinants of educational mismatches. And in the second section, we look at determinants of skill mismatches. And I'm going to be, if we have time, talk about those, but I'm going to be concentrating on not on the determinants of educational and skill mismatches, but I will concentrate on the effect of educational mismatches on job satisfaction and educational mismatches on looking for a job. And of course, there is a lot of literature on the effect of mismatches, especially both of those, skill and educational mismatches, on wages. A very large literature, and they find that these mismatches lower wages, especially if you are overeducated, you will get lower wages, and there is, I don't think, to our best knowledge, there is no study on effect of mismatches on wages in MENA region, and also there is no study on effect of mismatches on job satisfaction and looking for a job. And so we are looking at the determinants and also on job satisfaction and looking for the job. And now let me say a few words on the labor market in Algeria. It's very similar to the rest of the MENA countries, and I don't have to repeat these in detail, that they are well known to all of you, and we have very low women's labor force participation, and in spite of the large increase in the women's education levels, and that's called MENA paradox that my colleague before referred to, and also in Algeria, maybe somewhat differently from the rest of the MENA, the number of graduates from university higher education rose from 1,700 in 1970 to 350,000 in the recent years. And if you look at the unemployment, I don't know how relevant these information are for our presentation, but there are high rates of unemployment, higher for women than for men. And labor force participation we talked about, and how large increase in university graduates over time, especially recently. And where do graduates enroll? Mostly in social sciences rather than exact sciences. And how about the educational mismatch in Algeria? We have this for the total people in our sample, and for men and women separately. And now, if we examine this table, we will see that women hold math jobs with their level of education 54% and 48% for men. And so math jobs, women hold higher than for men. And women are more overeducated than men, and 24 versus 22%. And men are more undereducated than for women. So more men are undereducated than women. If you look at this by age, young people are more in line, hold jobs more in line with their education. They are matched. And young people, the adequacy of math jobs decrease with age, and from 56% for the young to 44% for the middle age to 21% for the higher educated. So older people are more undereducated than the young people, 72% for the people 60 years of age and over. And young people are mostly overeducated, and for example, age 15 to 24 and 25 to 35 are overeducated. And if we look at men and women separately, share of those holding jobs commensurate with their education increased for both men and women over time. And overeducated men, share of overeducated men has decreased over time, and share of undereducated men increased over time, and undereducated women has decreased over time. And there are several reasons for these developments in the labor market because of the large increase in educated people recently and entering labor market, large increases entering labor market, and the Algerian economy creating less qualified jobs to absorb the entrance. And the data we use and the statistics I just talked about are from labor force surveys of Algeria, and we use the ones conducted in 2003, 2005, 2007, 10, and 16 by Algerian labor statistics of National Office of Statistics, and these are the number of households interviewed, and of course we have larger number of individuals in the data. And now I'm going to focus on the impact of educational mismatch on job satisfaction and impact of educational mismatch on job search. And first, the job satisfaction. We use a probit model. We use a lot of covariates that are used in the large literature on job satisfaction. I should say that there is a very large literature on job satisfaction, but less literature investigate the impact of educational mismatch on job satisfaction. And so we use mostly the covariates that are used in the job satisfaction literature. And we use a probit model, and so dependent variable, if the takes the value of 1 if the individual is satisfied with the job, and 0 otherwise. And for job satisfaction, we analyze only the 2010 survey, because that's the only survey that asked about job satisfaction. And you cannot see this table, but don't worry. This includes all of the covariates we used, which I will talk about. And here is a table that shows you only the coefficients for the variables that we are interested in. Educational mismatch, job mismatch, on job satisfaction. And what is our results here? We look at overeducated, undereducated, and the matched situation. Huh? Oh, I'm very sorry. Okay. Overeducation decreases job satisfaction for men and women both. And undereducation increases job satisfaction for men and women both. And we have all these control variables that I was planning to talk about, and I won't. Some of these covariates have the effect in the job satisfaction literature. And let me now pass, since I have very few minutes, skill mismatch. And how do we define the skill mismatch? And there is a question in the survey. You have a job. Are you looking for another job? That's equal to 1. So it's a probability estimate. And you have a job. You are not looking for another job. And that's equal to 0 in our probability estimate. And this is our table that shows the results for skill mismatch. And we have positive coefficients for undereducated, and meaning that they are the overeducation increases the probability of looking for a job, and which means a larger turnover in the market, and undereducation decreases the probability of the job, which means again stable labor market, and we have socioeconomic characteristics. And so I won't be talking about covariates, and these results are estimated for all of the surveys we have, 2003, 7, 10, 16, and over time we observe an increase in overeducation and a decrease in undereducation, and so I should give you my final words. Where is my conclusions? We have this job search estimates. We have estimated individually for each of the years, and also, and the results are all robust throughout, even with using the pooled sample in the case of job search. And so these provide important information about labor market, because job is not being satisfied with your job reduces your productivity and increases turnover and reduces growth overall. And looking for the job similarly is important for the labor market, and these 2 points should be taken into consideration by the policymakers. Thank you for your attention.
I made the comments now. Thank you. And thank you for the presentation. I have some comments, and obviously I based my comments on the paper, and you were shorter in the presentation. Then maybe we can discuss after from some parts. Then I will skip the contribution. I think that we understand that the topics is very relevant, and as you mentioned, it goes behind the borders of Algeria. I think it's a very relevant subject. Then I go to my comments. Then I have several methodological comments because obviously the results are based on the methodology that we use in the paper. And in the first model, you used multinomial probit to find the determinant of educational mismatch. Then it's this methodology, and it's not obvious why you chose this methodology for educational mismatch and not for skills mismatch, for example. It's not sufficiently explained. And for the two, we have also two other probits for, as you explained in the presentation, to see the link between educational mismatch on job satisfaction and job search. And in this paper, we have multinomial probit and 3 probits. Then we use discrete variable modeling in the paper, but for the first one, multinomial probit, the outcome variables indicating 3 situations of educational mismatch, as you mentioned: overeducated, undereducated, and matched. It's the 3 modality. But there is an assumption in this methodology, that is, we use the principle of utility maximization. Then for each modality, you have preference. Then here we have three choices: overeducated and undereducated. But the result in terms of utility is the same, is bad. Then we cannot choose, I prefer to be undereducated, or I prefer to be I don't prefer to be overeducated or overeducated, under and over. I can also compare the situation with matched. Then match is better than over or under. But for under and over is not obvious. Then maybe the multinomial probit here is not appropriate because the hypothesis behind is not appropriate. And obviously, we have results that can be false. Then we propose 2 solutions to make the same to find the same explanation. The first one is to explore to modelize a sequential probit. The first step is to see if someone is mismatched or not. Then it's the first step. And if it is mismatched, then we can make another probit to consider under and over educated. And what is interesting with this methodology is that you can use different explanatory variables in each probit at each level. Then we are not, it's not mandatory to use the same explanatory variables for with this approach. The second one is to construct a latent factorial axis, then based on individual or sector variables. And now we can have use order rate probit model with under-educated, matched, and over-educated. Then you construct an indicator that you can class and have endogenous bounds to using this methodology. Then it could be better to explore these 2 methods to explain the first thing that you want to explain. For the last one, it's the relation that you present today. As you mentioned, you want to answer to the question how workers who experience a poor match between their own skills and those who require their current job motivated by this to quit their job in favor of another work. Then it's the last model that you present, and you use a probit considering job characteristics as explanatory variables. And here also maybe there is a a problem of cause and effect logic, and maybe you could consider a mismatch as a dummy. Here we have 3 modalities for these variables, but if you consider mismatch as match or not match, or mismatch, then with only 2 modality, maybe you could consider a B pro bit, because you have 4 possible case in this situation. You present 3 situations, but with the 3 modalities. But if you use a probit, you can test the fact that the mismatch and the job search and the mismatch are correlated or not. Then it's an interesting point that you can add to your paper, and after you can see the 4 possible cases. Then it could be also a good method to answer to this question. I have also other comments on the methodology, but I have a comment. You explained the relation between the labor force participation and the level of education, and I think in the paper there is a misleading about that, because we have a positive correlation between labor force participation and education, but the problem maybe is more the variation of labor force participation and the education, because here it's for Morocco. I take this data because I have the Moroccan data, and I think that it's quite similar. We see that we have an increase between when the education level increase, we have a labor force participation with the level of education, but the variation in labor force participation is decreasing, and the variation is more severe for educated. Then I'm not sure, but in the paper I think there is a confusion about that. Okay, I think I will stop and we can discuss, of course. Then now, if there is some comments in.
Thank you so much, Aysit and Moundir, for the paper. I have one comment regarding the way you're computing the skill mismatch. I didn't quite follow how you're doing the educational mismatch, but I was thinking about the skill mismatch, that there might be other reasons why individuals would be, for example, on the job and then end up searching for the job, for a new job. It wouldn't necessarily be a skill mismatch. For example, an individual could be looking for better opportunities. An individual could be more motivated to get into higher positions, but it's not necessarily that the job that they are having right now is.
She said like that. But then the discussant in the third pages of his paper, the presentation, I think mentioned the exact question. Like the question is directly asking if the person looking for a job because of is not happy with the job, that the job doesn't provide any advantage for her skills or his skills, or for other reasons also. I was thinking the same thing what you think, because maybe the person can change his job or her job because for a location change or for some other reasons. This I didn't understand exactly the question in the survey.
Thank you very much, Aysit Hocam, for presentation. So you said raise your questions to your co-author, but I'm going to ask to you. because I'm going to give a Turkish example. Well, I don't believe that mismatch always reduces productivity. Remember, Cüneyt Arkın was a medical doctor, but never worked as a doctor and became a very famous Turkish actor. So that's exactly a mismatch, right? Both skill mismatch and educational mismatch. But the productivity, we're not sure that the productivity of this guy has reduced. So, what do you think?
Who is it?
Cüneyt Arkın.
So I'm just still a little bit confused about how educational mismatch is defined. So could you please explain that in detail?
So thank you very much. Thank you, Dorothee, for the comments, and all colleagues for the comments. So I will start why we use for determinant of education mismatch the multinomial probit, because we have a variable with three categories compared to skill mismatch when we have dummy variables. But and the multinomial probit model is more relevant compared to multinomial logit because of IAA hypothesis of independence of alternatives. But we can try to re-estimate the models using all techniques. Sequential model, sequential probit, order probit, and after we can see which the model is better. So for the definition of, I start with skill mismatch. So for the definition of skill mismatch, so we have a question, clear question, that if your current job offer you sufficient scope to use your knowledge for the better job when you exercise, and we have dummy variable, yes, no. Is to allow you to do better your job if your skills, knowledge, and education allow you to do better your job better, and is dummy variable, yes, no. For the educational mismatch, so we have we have the average. We calculate the average using the mod of the number of education years for each groups of the same occupation. And after we compare this with using the correspondence table between education and occupational. And we see if we can classify individual in three categories: matched, over-educated, or under-educated. Why?
Why is the mode the right level?
Yeah.
So the mode is going to be higher than the correct level.
Yeah. So in the literature we find this. They usually use the mode, but we can use other average and to compare. Yes. And, so the confusion is in we use skill mismatch, and after job search is different. So skill mismatch, we ask this question if the education allows to people to do their current job. So for the search, we ask if the people they are looking for another job, and after we have dummy variable, yes, no, and we have the answer why. So maybe we can use this. Yeah, maybe they can use this for the wage, education.
For another reason. It's clear.
Yeah.
That they are looking for a job because of their skill mismatch.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think. Just for the last one, we are not looking for the relation between education and female labor for participation. So we do this in the descriptive analysis, And I have I have a paper with Rana Hendy and Dorothee Boccanfuso about this paradox between education, female education, and labor force participation. Yeah. In the paper. Yeah.
I'm sorry that your comments were on the part of the paper that I really did not present, but I appreciated your comments very much, and we will consider alternative estimation methods for those. And in terms of using the mode that Ragi has asked, mode is more appropriate than the average, arithmetic average, which is influenced mostly by the extremities. And so in terms of computing educational mismatch, we are looking at acquired level of education in the field that the individual has, with the level of education the individual has in that field, and the one that is considered most appropriate for the job. And the one that's considered most appropriate for the job is given by ISCO, and the International Standard Classification of Jobs of the ILO. That's the job requirement. And I won't go into skill mismatches because we have that statement in the survey. And my colleague from Turkey here gave the example of an actor who was actually a doctor and became a movie star. And that did not reduce his productivity. I think he was still as productive because he was satisfied in his job. He was satisfied in his job.
Is fine. I'm talking about productivity.
If you are not satisfied with your job, your productivity will be lower.
Hello, I am very happy to be here after a long time in an ERF conference. I am Deniz Karaoğlan Yurtseven from Gebze Technical University, Turkey, and this is a joint work with Serap, Sağir, Meltem, Dayioğlu, and Şirin, Saraçoğlu. And in fact, this research is supported by the Scientific and Technological Research Council of Turkey. And I try to tell you the impact of the maternal education on early childhood development in Turkey. And what is our motivation? We all know that human capital accumulation is very important for the country's economic growth. And until recently, the human capital accumulation consists of schooling rate completion and higher education participation rates regarding the education. But then Heckman comes and say that Heckman and his friends studies show that human capital accumulation starts in very early periods of life. Therefore, investing in early childhood education is very important. In fact, they show that the return, the later life returns is higher. If you invest in earlier, then you get higher returns, rather than you start to invest in the child in other education levels. And this is the Heckman's picture. Heckman and Kunhas, they form this graph from their studies, and you see that higher returns comes from the earlier you invest in child, the higher you get returns in later life. And what are these returns? education outcomes, labor market outcomes, and of course health outcomes. Therefore, in recent studies and in recent meetings, the policymakers take early childhood education development into account very seriously. And it is one of the important topics of United Nations in 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, and in Turkey in our development plans in 2019 and 2023, and in the new plans the meetings were in December. Early childhood development is taken into account seriously. And in this part, this is of course a part of the project, and in this part of the project, we mainly focus on the effect of mother's education level on early childhood development, the development of the child. Why we focus on the mother's education development? Again, you all know very well from the literature, maternal education has positive impact on child's health outcomes, child's education outcomes, and in addition to them, child's language development, cognitive development. Therefore, we take the main control variable in the study is maternal education. And what is our contribution? The literature, in fact, on early childhood development, the determinants of early childhood development, because it is new topic, and the literature is scarce, and the studies are generally on comes from high-income developed countries, and there are, in fact, very limited studies regarding the middle-income and developing countries. And Turkey is a middle-income developing country. And we try to examine it for Turkey. And our data set is the famous Turkish demographic and health survey data set prepared by Hacettepe University. It is a very rich data set and contains information on women at their reproductive age and their children between 0 to 59 months old. And we use the latest round of the TDH data set, the 2018 round of. Why do we choose this? Why do we only use this? Because for the first time in 2018, demographic health survey data sets includes a set of questions on early childhood development. The questions are asked for the children between 36 to 59 months old. Therefore, our operational sample consists of 1,072 children who can be linked to their mothers. And how do we create the early childhood development indicator? Whether we examine whether the child is developmentally on track or not by first creating the early child development indicator based on 10 questions. The questionnaires consist of 10 questions regarding the literacy and numeracy skills of the child, physical development, learning readiness, and of course socio-emotional development. And this 10-item questionnaire is adopted from the early childhood development model of the UNICEF's multiple cluster surveys. And there are, I do not mention all the questions, of course. What are the questions? For instance, let's take the literacy and numeracy domain. For instance, if the child can identify at least 10 letters of alphabet, or can read 4 popular words, or can name and recognize the symbols and can symbol of all numbers from 1 to 10, And if 3 of these 2 are satisfied, the child is developmentally on track regarding the literacy and numeracy domain. And for the other domains, there are other questions. And in the end, following United Nations criteria and following Lausanne and France, the child is considered as developmentally on track if he or she can satisfy at least 3 of these 4 development domains. And in our empirical analysis, we say that the child is if the child is developmentally on track, we create an dummy variable, and this dummy variable equals to 1, and otherwise it equals to 0. And here are the descriptive statistics. I mentioned the most important ones. You see, according to our sample, 74% of children between 36 and 59 months old are developmentally on track. And when we look at male children and when we look at descriptive statistics by gender, you see that female children are more likely to be on developmental on track. The percentage of female children developmental on track is higher. And regarding the physical development and learning readiness, nearly 100% of them are developmental on track, but there are differences in literacy, numeracy domain and socio-emotional domain. And let's look at, regarding literacy and numeracy domain, only 14.6% are on developmental on track. And regarding the socio-emotional development, we observe that 73.6% are developmentally on track, and we observe there is a significant variation between female and male children regarding the socio-emotional development. And our sample consists of 31% of the mothers have high school or higher degree, the most important descriptive statistics, and 23.3% from bottom 20% wealth quantile, and 16.6% from the top percent, because wealth will be important at the end of the analysis. You will see wealth is important. And methodology, a basic linear probability model where the dependent variable is early childhood development indicator. Here is S is the years of schooling of the mother, and X includes control variables as exogenous as possible, such as the region, birth order of the child, number of the siblings, household size. And our main coefficient of interest is, of course, beta 1. And we make several analyses. We replicate the model by using the stages of the mother's education levels as dummies rather than the continuous variable. We conduct analysis for males and females separately. We replicate the analysis for each subcomponents of early childhood development. And we replicate the analysis where the dependent variable is kindergarten attendance and number of developmental activities, number of mother with their children. But I do not present them. I will consider in the results because I have limited time. And of course, when I write the project with Meltem, this is part of the project proposal with Meltem Hoca, we aim to identify a causal effect. And in fact, the title of the presentation is the impact of the maternal education. And for in order to overcome, because mother's education level and the early childhood development may be endogenous due to unobserved factors such as genetic factors. And we try to make a causal analysis and instrumental variable analysis where we use the 1917 schooling reform in Turkey as instrumental variable. However, here is the endogeneity test statistic results, and you see the high p-values. The test statistic results that the early childhood development indicator and mother's education level has no endogenous relationship. Therefore, we choose to continue with the linear probability models rather than using instrumental variable approach. And here are the main results. Again, I will emphasize on the most important results. And you see that if the child is female, it is 77.6 percentage points higher that she's more like she's on developmentally on track. And look at mother's years of schooling, our main variable of interest. It increases if mother's years of schooling increases. Okay, by 1 year, then approximately it is more 1 percentage points higher. The child is developmental on track. And let's look at the other model, and you see that for the models with high school or higher degree, the child is more likely to be on developmental on track. And look at, please, the wealth index. If the child is from richer families, then he is advantageous in terms of early childhood development. And the literacy numeracy domain is, if you remember from the descriptive statistics, only 14% are on developmental on track regarding this domain. And especially for male children, we see that if the mother has high education, high school education or higher, it increases the likelihood of the male child of being developmental on track by 14.2 percentage points. And physical development, and in fact physical development, we have nearly 100% are on domain, therefore the coefficients are not so important. And learning readiness domain, especially again, we see the positive effect of mother's education for male children. And in fact, in all the regressions, wealth is the most important factor. And here is our conclusions. I repeat the exercise. The regressions were dependent variables is the kindergarten attendance and the number of developmental activities, and all the regressions in all the early child development indicators and subcomponents. We see that if the mother has high school or a higher education degree, then the child is more likely to be on developmentally on track. Therefore, mother's education is very important for the sustainability of human capital education. And of course, as you realize, wealth index, in fact, for our analysis, we see that it is more important than the coefficients are higher, the impacts, the relationship seems to be higher. Again, wealth index, if the child is from richer families, then he is or she is more advantageous. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're already out of time, so I'll be extremely quick, and I'll try to focus only on my main comments. So thank you very much for this great work. Let me just make it full screen. Great, so maybe I don't have to repeat. I tried to summarize what the authors are doing. So the main finding is that mother's education really matters, and also household wealth matters for early childhood development. So I'll try to focus on my main comments. They are related to mother's characteristics. Mother's characteristics that you're controlling for. So you, of course, in addition to education, you're also controlling for whether the child goes to kindergarten or not. And also, I found it really interesting, the number of activities that the mother spends or does with her child. However, I was wondering if there is any information on the duration or anything related to time use, the time that mothers spends on childcare, right? Because literature has showed that it's not only about the number of activities, but it's about the duration that the mother spends with her child on each of these activities, or on the total duration spent on childcare. So this is really important. So if you have any information about that and can show some descriptives, I think that would be very, very interesting. Also, I was wondering why you're not taking into consideration at all anything related to mothers' activities in the labor market, employment status, because again, I mean, I'm thinking about the literature on Egypt. You know, mothers will tend to send their kids to kindergarten mostly if they are working, right? And also literature shows that working mothers spend more time on childcare than non-working moms. So employment, again, here I'm referring to the case of Egypt, employment really matters. Did you try to account for that in your regression? And I open directly, if you allow me, the discussion to allow for more questions, and I'll be happy to share those comments with you. So any questions, comments?
Although you suggested that there is an endogeneity test, but still, for this paper, I would like to see at least the IV results as well. I mean, at least as a robustness or something, it needs to be provided, I think so. Moreover, some of the variables are more in the index, while creating the index, some variables are at least more related with the education, right? So, like literacy. I mean, physical part is directly related with the, because, I mean, during the pregnancy, so these physical things could be affected with the education during the pregnancy, but the literacy, for instance, is directly related with the mother's education. So at least, in addition to creating an index, you can separately look the effects of the education on these separate items, right? So it would give you a better idea. I don't know, I didn't read the paper, but as Rana's comment, so I understand that you added some controls like the number of activities, but they're also endogenous, right? So if my index is low, so I will spend more time with my children, more activities, so that sort of problems exist there.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, even she uses one IV for the education, maybe it's not enough, then the rest of the variables can be also indigenous. So I just wonder, because most of the people in Turkey, I mean, in the Turkish literature, they use this compulsory education policy like the first paper used. Why you didn't report these findings? Because you said for indigeneity you use this compulsory schooling law. But so you didn't find any effect? Insignificant, okay. Yeah, because there is a similar paper just recently published in 2022 May by Dursun on this schooling of girls, compulsory education law, and the children's health. But they didn't use the indicator you used, but they used this low birth rate, for instance, mostly health. But for me, I think you suffer. I mean, the paper suffers from indigeneity. Yeah, at the end. In general.
Thank you. So I have a question. In the survey, the question related to child development is asked for all member families, not just for the mother. So maybe for the member family older than 15. So maybe all family or not just the mother can contribute to child development. So how can you separate just the effect of education of mother? You understand or not? In the survey, the question is asked for all families. The mother, the father, brother, sister, if they can have an impact on child development. So how can you separate just the effect of mother education and not the all families?
It's more of a comment. I was wondering if, for example, it would be interesting in this type of exercise to also compare what one additional year of schooling, for example, of the mother gives in terms of early childhood development with one additional year for the father. I'm not sure if this exercise was done before in the MENA region, and I think it could be interesting to just have a comparison between mothers and fathers' educational attainment.
First, Mümin Hocam, I think it's a misunderstanding. The number of development activities and the kindergarten attendance are not independent variables. They are dependent in another exercise. And your question, Rana, we do not consider employment because we think that employment is highly endogenous, correlated with the education. Therefore, we prefer to focus on education. But you are right, we can try employment. And okay. Other question, okay, we should present the IV results, but I say they are insignificant. And we mainly considered in the paper as well literacy and socio-emotional. Socio-emotional, in fact, the socio-emotional subcomponent is in fact a significant variation. And your question, hocam, okay, we try to look at the separate families' education levels separately. And thank you very much for the nice comment for the father's education. Thank you.
Thank you. Then we finish the session. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.